All right, you should be live. Go right ahead.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Amy Kennedy, a mental health advocate. I'm so glad to be joined today with two experts in the field of eating disorders who are here to share some great tips for heading back to school. Unfortunately, it's that time of year already. We've known it for a while. We're seeing kind of the backpacks and everything already on the shelves, and I'm not quite as prepared as I would like to be with my own 5 kids, but there's a lot more to getting ready for back to school than just the pencils and notebooks. And we know all the anxiety and stress that can come along with feeling like you are prepared. So I'm really glad to be joined by both Dr. Hill and Oona Hanson, and I'd love to have you each just introduce yourselves a little bit. Maybe you could tell me a little bit about yourself and the work that you do. How about if we start with you, Dr. Hill?
Sure. Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here today. So I am Dr. Katherine Hill. I'm a board certified pediatrician and eating disorder specialist, and I am Vice President of Medical Affairs at EQIP. And in my role at EQIP, one of the main missions I'm trying to help achieve is really getting at that educational gap with eating disorders. And that means really trying to better educate our medical providers in this country on how to identify and diagnose eating disorders promptly. But that also means the educators that are teaching our kids, making sure they know how to better identify eating disorders in the classroom, as well as the families out there, and making sure these kids are getting picked up promptly. We know that if we can diagnose an eating disorder quickly and get those people to treatment quickly, then they're more able to recover and have a better prognosis. So that's sort of one of the missions that I'm spearheading here at EQIP.
Thanks so much. And Oona?
Yeah, hi, I'm Oona Hanson. I'm a family mentor here at EQIP. My first career was as a high school English teacher and field hockey coach. And when I had my own kids, I shifted into parent education. And when one of my kids developed an eating disorder, more and more of my work with parents became about eating disorder awareness, prevention, treatment options. And so I'm just so passionate about kind of the ways that schools and parents can work together to lower the risk, and as Katherine said, identify these disorders as early as possible. Because I'll share that I was one of those people who I thought I knew about eating disorders. I had a background in educational psychology. I worked with high school athletes. I knew people with eating disorders, and I like to say I knew just enough to be dangerous. And I think a lot of people are in that boat where we think we know about eating disorders, and that false confidence based on a lot of myths or popular culture messages, that really is part of that gap that Dr. Hill just mentioned. And so it's really my passion to get this information out there to the people who need it most.
Oh, that's terrific. Some people watching might say, well, educators, why would they be kind of in this needing to know? We're not there when they're eating lunch, but maybe you are. Maybe you're serving double duty. We did serve a lunch duty, and we're also teaching a class, and you pick up those other skills. Did you ever have to do a lunch duty while you were working?
I never had to do lunch duty because I taught in a high school, so the kids were, they were on their own at lunch. But I would say, every classroom is a community, and communities connect and gather around food. So food comes into play in classrooms. Obviously, if you're in science lab, you're not eating. There's certain areas where you're not going to be eating with students, but food does come up. But also just the ways that eating disorders can affect students' behavior and ability to learn and connect in the classroom. So even if you're a teacher who doesn't ever interact around food with your students, I think it's still really important for you to know, some of the red flags and the warning signs, and also keeping in mind some assignments that you might have taught year after year, knowing that you might have students in your class who are vulnerable to eating disorders, and maybe taking a second look at the way you talk about food or bodies that could be potentially harming some of your students. And no teacher wants to do that.
Oh, that's really helpful. Well, maybe we could start with some of the facts. You could share a little bit about what we should, as consumers know about eating disorders and to be able to support loved ones. And then we can talk a little bit about those red flags that we should look out for. Dr. Hill?
Yeah, I can jump in there. So, yeah, I think the big question is, why do we care about eating disorders? Why do we want to educate on eating disorders? And the reason is a fewfold, but first of all, they're extremely common. So about 5 million Americans will develop an eating disorder this year alone. And over the course of a lifetime, about 30 million Americans will develop an eating disorder. And so that's about 1 in 10 of the population. So they're really common. They're also really dangerous. Eating disorders are the second deadliest mental health condition in this country, a close second only to opioid addiction. And so we need to be able to identify these eating disorders and, again, get people to proper treatment. So we're not having these fatalities from eating disorders. This is largely a disease that affects a lot of young people, and young people should not have to deal with an illness that could potentially be deadly. I also love to bust some myths about eating disorders, because chances are, if you're a consumer of the media, if you've read an article about an eating disorder, it probably features a skinny white girl with a tape measure around her waist, or maybe looking at a scale, looking really sad. That's kind of our popular image of what an eating disorder looks like. And while that population does get eating disorders, I think it's really important that everybody out there realize that eating disorders affect all types of people. So that includes all ages, all genders, all ethnicities, all socioeconomic statuses, and also all body sizes. So you do not have to be in a smaller body to develop an eating disorder. And in fact, there is just a study that came out yesterday in JAMA Pediatrics that showed, looking at 9 and 10-year-old school children, that the people in higher weight bodies actually had a higher risk of disordered eating symptoms than those in smaller bodies. So I think that's just a few of the myths that I like to bust and make sure that people are well aware of.
I think you even bring up a good one with that study, 9 and 10-year-olds, you said.
9 and 10-year-olds, yeah.
So I think we typically think of somebody like a teenager more caring about their appearance versus imagining that someone as young as, 2nd, 3rd grade might be experiencing an eating disorder already.
That's right. And sometimes we even see younger. I feel like we're seeing younger and younger patients developing eating disorders. And there's some eating disorders that affect even younger kids, a condition called ARFID, or ARFID, which stands for Avoidant and Restrictive Food Intake Disorder, can affect really, really young kids. And then we start to see other eating disorders like anorexia nervosa or bulimia nervosa really as early as maybe 7 or 8 years old. So these are diseases that affect pretty much anybody at any point in their age span, starting in really those early elementary years. So I think it's good for teachers to have that on their radar. So you're not just thinking about the 15-year-olds out there, but other kids as well.
That's really helpful. I think as an educator, we had in services, we definitely were honed into allergies and food allergies. And we were learning a lot about those types of things that we should be on the lookout for, but some more education about what signs or things that we should look for when it comes to eating disorders would be really helpful. Oona, what do you suggest that people should be kind of mindful of if they're worried about someone?
Yeah, I think, if you're an educator or a parent worried about a child, or maybe you're a coach, right, in a youth sports program or something, and you're worried about a child, I think you can never go wrong with compassion and curiosity, and checking in with the child or their caregiver, and knowing that, eating disorders are not a choice or a phase or a lifestyle. Unfortunately, I think, to your point, Amy, that a lot of people think it's maybe like an adolescent or teenage vanity issue. And it's not about that at all. But it might look like that if all you've seen are the back to school specials from like our Gen X kind of growing up. And so I think knowing that, again, that this is not a phase, this is not something to take a wait and see approach to. I know a lot of parents have been told that, we're being helicopter parents or snowplow parents, and we should kind of back off and give kids more space. And so if a well-meaning adult, maybe a pediatrician even, or maybe a school counselor says, you know what, don't make too much of a fuss about their eating or you'll make it worse. Let's take a wait and see approach. I mean, Dr. Hill might disagree with me, but so I want to hear what you would say about this. But I've met so many families who were told, you know, don't rush in and get, you know, give this too much attention. Don't put a spotlight on their eating. And really what happened is the child just got sicker and sicker. And when they finally did get access to treatment, their illness had really progressed. And so a lot of parents wish they'd been told, act now, don't wait. There's really like the risk of sort of overreacting. And I'm putting it in quotation marks because I don't think there really is a way to overreact, whereas there's a very real risk of underreacting or waiting too long for treatment.
Yeah, and Oona, you couldn't have said it better. I completely agree that with lots of different things, teenagers and young kids are building their independence, and we should help support them in building their independence. But when it comes to something that's potentially really dangerous, like an eating disorder, they are not phases. And often they only get better when somebody gets proper treatment. And so do not delay. If you have a child that you're worried about, whether you're a teacher or a caregiver or a parent, it is really essential that you're trying to get that kid to proper medical care to make sure there's no significant medical complications that need to be taken care of quickly, but also proper mental health treatment as well. Yeah, couldn't agree more, Oona.
What you mentioned earlier, Oona, some of the conversations that might happen in a classroom, in a community around food, even, you know, around assignments that have to do with food. Could you tell us a little bit, maybe give some examples about what you mean there?
Yeah, I think, you know, we all live in this a culture that's taught us that we should have really rigid rules about food, that we should put food in a hierarchy, that we should put bodies in a hierarchy. So this is sort of the water we're all swimming in. And so I think a lot of very common assignments doesn't even raise any red flags for a teacher. So for instance, like our little ones and like, you know, the elementary or the primary grades, you know, those kids love to sort and categorize things, right? That's like developmentally appropriate of like, oh, the red blocks go here and the blue blocks go here. And what happens is, you know, well-meaning health assignments say, oh, let's start sorting food into categories and not like, what do I like? What don't I like? Or this is, you know, this is in season, this is not in season, but rather putting them into sort of like good and bad categories, but it usually gets called healthy and unhealthy, right? So again, the average person might think, yeah, of course we want kids to learn about healthy eating, but that kind of binary, kind of rigid rule type assignment, you know, for a young kid who's a black and white thinker, that could really create some fear and rules around food. In the middle school years, we see a lot of things like tracking their fitness activity and reporting it to the PE teacher, or having competitions, like which classroom can get the most steps. And again, it sounds well-meaning. Oh, it's kind of fun, they're being active. But this can really tip a child into obsessive quantification of exercise and kind of hurting that relationship with movement that we want to be fun and joyful. In the high school years, we see a lot of things like food diaries, analyzing meal plans, and kind of critiquing like what should someone take out of their diet. And anytime a kid is being told to take something out of their diet, this is really running the risk of triggering disordered eating and an eating disorder. One other assignment I'll mention, because this happened in our family, there are a lot of very compelling food documentaries out there that you know, high school teachers might show, not just in a health class, but maybe in a social studies class. So I know you taught history, Amy. So kind of looking at kind of the cultural conversation around like where our food comes from or around fast food. And these documentaries are designed to entertain and provoke. And if they're not presented to students as something to debate and discuss, but as like, this is fact, it can really, it can go sideways quickly, right? And kids can start to fear foods and fear body changes, and that can really set someone up for disordered eating or an eating disorder.
That's really helpful. I was just thinking about, you know, assignments where you're asked to bring foods in, or where, so you really have expanded my thoughts about what that might look like at school and assignments based on that I hadn't considered. So that's really helpful. And, you know, when you mentioned about tracking your steps or your weight or what you're doing, immediately thinking about high school athletes and how they might be affected, both of all genders, whether it's different sports where you might be cutting weight or where you might be trying to bulk up to increase your power. Katherine, is this something that we see a lot? Is it something parents need to be on the lookout for, or red flags there to be concerned about?
Absolutely. And that's actually how I first got into this field. Is I was an athlete myself, and there were some weight pressures that we felt on our team, that if you looked in the medical literature at that point, I was a swimmer, and it didn't look like there was any risk for swimmers because swimmers tended to be normal weight, right? And so it used to be thought that, you didn't get an eating disorder if you were normal weight. Now we know that's completely wrong. And we also know that athletes of any sport can develop an eating disorder. And it's a pretty nuanced discussion, because there are certainly those sports teams out there that can be a very positive experience for kids. It can help show you how to build, work hard and be a great teammate and improve your body image if the coaches are able to give those right messages. Or it could go the other way too, where I've heard, coaches that are inadvertently saying, okay, well, you need to eliminate junk food and you need to never eat X, Y, Z. And so these are kids who, again, are pretty black and white thinkers. And they say, oh, well, my coach told me to stop eating sugar. Sugar's bad. So I'm going to stop eating anything that has even a little bit of sugar in it. And there are certain kids who can take it a step too far and start. Eating disorders often start with really good intentions. Often it's a change to, I'm going vegan because I want to help the environment, right? Or they watch a documentary in their health class about it. These are stories that come up over and over again for my patients. Or, I went to health class and I learned that if I eat too much sugar, I'm going to get diabetes. So I'm just going to cut all that out, right? And so kids can be, whereas an adult may be able to take that information and view it in a more nuanced way. For a child, sometimes they see it in such a black and white way that, they can go too far in the other direction to the point that it becomes a problem. So I guess in a nutshell, young athletes can be at risk, and it really depends on, the sort of messaging and the team culture that the coach is helping to establish. So for any coaches out there, PE teachers, I think a few important points to hammer home are that, not trying to categorize food as good food or bad food. Young athletes, particularly athletes who are still growing, have very unique nutritional needs, and often almost always need to eat more than the adults in their family, for instance, and may underestimate the nutritional needs their body really needs to support their growth and their activities. So anyway, in a nutshell, it's complicated when it comes to sports and coaches, but those are just a few of the ways that young athletes can be at risk or even protected from eating disorders.
So how could we support them going back to school? What are some of the things that families, educators, coaches can do to help support not just athletes, but students returning?
Yeah, and I want to comment briefly on PE, because I also think PE is pretty relevant here. And traditionally in this country, there's been a lot of emphasis placed on, standardized fitness testing, evaluating somebody's cardiovascular fitness, and they get grades based on how that goes. Or sometimes in some classes, they're even doing BMI measurements in the school. And again, for certain predisposed individuals, and we think eating disorders are largely genetic, for people who may have the right mixture of genetics, being weighed in front of a whole classroom full of peers might be a very triggering sort of event, particularly if they get classified in the red zone, right? And we know that the BMI is not a great measurement and really doesn't correlate very well with overall health or cardiovascular fitness. So I'd love to see PE courses as well as sports teams really moving away from these sorts of metrics, and instead focusing on, how do we teach these kids to enjoy movement, to do it because they want to achieve a goal, because they want to be good teammates, and really focus on those sorts of aspects rather than how naturally athletic or what somebody's BMI happens to be.
That's really helpful. I am thinking, Oona, you probably have a different perspective you could share with us on ways to support from as a parent, or an educator.
Yeah, I'm thinking about, it's going to be lunchbox packing season soon. And it's for some families in certain parts of the country, it already is. I think some schools went back to school yesterday. I think there's a lot of pressure on parents to send like a beautiful rainbow bento box, right? And things are cut into cute shapes. And if that's if that's what you love to do as a parent, go for it. I think it's really important for parents to just be aware of those pressures of sending their kid, like, am I going to impress the teacher or something if my child has this beautiful lunchbox, and really get back in touch with what your kid needs. And they need energy at school, and they need things that are easy to eat in a chaotic, maybe even stressful, overstimulating lunchroom. So this might be some of those more like comfort foods or familiar foods. This might be from an aisle in the grocery store that you don't usually go down. So I would really involve your kids in a developmentally appropriate way, depending on their age, in kind of what they want to bring for lunch. And if they're getting hot lunch at school, really finding out, like, how long do you have to wait in line? Like, would it be helpful to have like a granola bar with you to tide you over? And so getting really practical, and also just taking some of the pressure off that kind of, what kids are eating at school is less important than kids getting enough to eat and feeling comfortable eating at school.
Yeah. And then I would imagine, like myself, there's probably concerned parents that aren't sure that what they send actually gets eaten. So is there something that we should do in our communication with the school to try and make sure that there's follow through on that end? What do you recommend?
Certainly. I mean, if a child is in eating disorder treatment, absolutely caregivers need to be in touch with the school and figure out what kind of meal supervision or support that child needs. I think one key role that educators can play is not to require kids to eat food in a certain order, or going back to those kind of food rules that might be in the classroom, and really taking a look at how that actually could do unintended harm. So if you say to a child, like, you have to eat your fruit before your chips or whatever it is, or looking at, does the school have a policy of not allowing kids to bring certain kinds of things? Like, I've heard there are some schools with like a no juice policy, things like that. Like, juice can be great energy for kids to get at school. And so sometimes these really well-intended approaches can backfire and end up hurting kids' health and nutrition kind of in the bigger picture. So it's all about, I think, communication, and families who have the resources or time to get involved and find out what is my school's policy and who does monitor the lunch area. That can give a lot of important information too.
That's great. Dr. Hill?
Yeah, I just wanted to add on to that, Oona, that I think one of the triggers that we know is a risk factor for developing an eating disorder is food talk, diet talk, and weight talk. And so I think if you're an educator and you're engaging with children in the classroom, no matter what their age, I think it's important to, not make comments about a child's lunch, even if it's saying something like, wow, you must be really hungry, or look at that big lunch. There's no way you can eat all that, or look at that amazing lunch. That looks really delicious. I mean, so, I think you just have to be very careful about the messages you're sending to kids, because again, for most kids, it might be fine, but there might be that small population of kids who take that and in their brain, it turns into something that can be a seed for an eating disorder. It also is true about talking about bodies. So you may be tempted when you are a teacher and you have a student come back who's grown a lot, or maybe they've been going through puberty and they've changed a lot since the last school year. You might be tempted to really comment and say, oh my gosh, wow, you've grown so much, or you've changed so much. But commenting on anybody's body, including your own, has been shown to increase risk of eating disorders. So I think that's also something to keep in mind. I would instead try to find ways to compliment students that have nothing to do with their appearance, nothing to do with the meal that they're bringing. So complimenting them on their, the fact that they worked really hard on that homework assignment, or the fact that they're a really good friend, or you saw them do something kind for somebody else. Those are the sorts of traits that we should be celebrating, I think.
I guess this is as true for the teachers talking about their own journey as well, right? I know all the time kids are bringing in desserts for their birthday, or and a lot of times the teacher will say, oh, I'm on a diet, I'm not going to have any today. Is that something they also should be avoiding saying to the students?
Yeah, ideally, yes. And it's so hard because in our society, we are so focused on, healthy eating and lifestyle and avoiding desserts, or not eating desserts too much, and our own shape and weight. It's just something that is so ubiquitous in our culture. It can be hard to really stay away from those topics of conversation. But I think it's important for all of us, and also certainly if you're a parent as well, this holds true, to not try to steer the conversation away from topics like body shape or weight, even if you're complimenting somebody. So oftentimes if somebody loses weight in our society, it's really socially acceptable to compliment somebody on their weight loss. But again, that person, you don't know, they may have an eating disorder. And if you compliment somebody's weight loss who has an eating disorder, that can be really start a spiral effect, a snowballing effect that kind of can trigger something more. And kids hear these conversations and they're really perceptive. And from a young age, they start to pick up on the fact that, oh, if my body is changing, I need to go on a diet to alter it, right? And so if we can steer away from those conversations, then kids may be less triggered to buy into this whole diet culture that's so ubiquitous.
So that's kind of a lot about what we should avoid saying, but knowing that we still want to teach kids about, whether it's in health class, they're still going to learn the food pyramid, or they're going to learn some of these things. How can we frame those lessons that we want young people to learn about food in a way that's not going to kind of have these negative? Is there a way that that it can be done? Kind of.
I mean, you can certainly talk about.
Say it, but.
Yeah, no, I think getting away from categorizing foods as either good foods or bad foods is a big one, because that's something that we see done in many schools, right? That there is no inherent moral value for food. There are some foods that you should be able to enjoy once in a while. If you're at a birthday party, you should be able to have a piece of cake and not feel guilty about it, right? That's just part of being in our society and living life and enjoying life. Now, should you eat birthday cake 3 times a day? Maybe not, but you know what I mean? So there shouldn't be this guilt that kids feel when they eat a food because in class they categorize it as an unhealthy food, right? And so I think trying to get kids to appreciate, instead, maybe talking about where their food comes from, right? Let's talk about where the garden grows, right? And how does a strawberry come to be, right? Like where do we get our food, and talking about those sorts of topics, and gear it towards the developmental level. But that might be a better way to get our students to really appreciate food and where it comes from and the way it tastes, and be able to enjoy it. I mean, enjoying food is a part of life as well. And not making somebody feel so badly when they're eating something that's, quote, unhealthy.
Sounds like maybe there's some curriculum changes that could happen, maybe some other policy changes that you might recommend when it comes to schools, and how this could be approached, whether it's through screening or, health class. What are your thoughts on things we could be doing to ensure that all young people have access to treatment, or that they're learning about how to recognize these signs earlier? Are there things we could be advocating for?
Absolutely. And I think it does start really at the school level. That's a good place to start, and revamping the way we are talking about foods, diet, exercise, and health class, as well as PE class. Not penalizing somebody for doing poorly on a standardized fitness test, but instead rewarding students for the effort they put in, being a good team player, those sorts of things. And really what I in my ideal world, PE class would instead teach kids to find ways of moving their body that brings them joy, that makes them feel good, because activity and exercise can be so beneficial when done in the right way, right? It can become a problem if it's done too much and for the wrong reasons, but when done for the right reasons, which can include, I want to boost my mood, I want to sleep better, I want to relieve my stress because I have an exam coming up. Those are, or I'm an athlete and I want to achieve something, right? So sports and exercise can be a really positive thing when somebody learns how to do it properly. And I think in general, PE curricula in this country don't teach kids necessarily how to love the activity they do or find ways of moving their body that bring them joy. Whereas I really believe that there is something for everyone out there. They may not love to run the mile for time at school. And often that turns people away from activity that, they could find other ways of moving their body that actually is fun for them, that they would want to do on an ongoing basis in a sustainable way.
Well, I have to give my kids' PE teacher a shout out because she makes it so fun for them, and her name's Miss Pomato. And of course, she not only makes the physical activity fun, but she even invited the kids to come join her to pick blueberries this summer. So goes back to your point of learning about where foods come from. And so she invited any kids that wanted to come out and pick blueberries, because I'm in New Jersey, the blueberry capital here. So it was really sweet. But I hear that, and I think that there's a lot we could do. Oona, can you think of some recommendations if you're a parent advocate or an educator who maybe wants their union to be doing more?
Yeah, I think from an educator standpoint, I know I'm in California. I know the state of California is reviewing, and I'm not sure exactly where they are in the process of updating the kind of health and wellness curriculum to address some of these very things that you're asking about. And for parents, if you get that notice that your child's being weighed and they're going to have a BMI report card, some schools are still doing this, parents can opt out. And so that to me is that kind of individual activism that a family can do to protect their kid. And it's also sending a message to the school, right? So as more and more parents say, I think this could be harmful to my child and we're going to opt out. I think that gives school leadership, a chance to reflect and reconsider. And, the data on BMI report cards is that, there hasn't been any sort of positive effect, but we've seen a lot of harmful effects. So it's sort of a vestige of a well-intended effort to track certain things. But from a parent to a parent, if you feel like I don't want my kid weighed at school, you can ask that they opt out of that.
Interesting. From our perspective of advocating, it's thinking about the screenings that they could do for all of behavioral health at school. So as you mentioned, getting weighed and measured, and hearing and eye tests and scoliosis tests are so common at the school nurse's office, yet the checkup from the neck up isn't something that typically happens at school, but could, and we could intervene early. So those universal screenings are something we could advocate for, as well as some of those curriculum changes that might make a difference. We know that access and making sure that kids know where to go for help is really important. What if a parent is worried right now, or an educator is worried? As they're listening to this conversation, they're thinking about somebody, and they just can picture in their mind that interaction that they had recently, and now they're worried. What should be kind of the first steps? Where do they look for help? Are there screening tools that they could employ? And maybe you could walk us through what that would look like, Dr. Hill.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think going back to what we spoke about earlier, eating disorders are almost never a phase. They almost never get better on their own. And in fact, they tend to smolder and maybe even get worse if left alone. And so if you have a child, whether that's your own child, another loved one, or a student in a classroom, it is really essential that you try to get that child to medical care and proper treatment as quickly as possible. And of course, this can be really tricky, right? But I think teachers, particularly the best teachers that I can think of, were the ones that really took an interest in a student's general well-being, right? Not just how they were doing in that one class, but their general well-being. And so often educators are in a very unique position to be the trusted source, the trusted adult in that child's life who, maybe they wouldn't hear it coming from a parent, but coming from a teacher, they may be more likely to go and seek care. And it's a little tricky when certainly there are cases where somebody may have an eating disorder, and if confronted or asked about their eating disorder, that eating disorder voice can get very threatened and very loud. And so sometimes people with eating disorders do not want to get treatment, and that's challenging, of course. And in those cases, it's absolutely essential to make sure the family is getting involved. The type of treatment we do at Equip is called FBT, or family-based treatment. And it is the most evidence-based way we know of to treat adolescent eating disorders. And that includes, children, adolescents, and young adults, I should add, that are living at home with a caregiver. And so we know that by involving the family, these kids have the best chance of recovery. And one of the tenets of FBT is creating a sense of urgency, really getting the family to know that this child has something that's dangerous, and we need to get them weight restored as quickly as we can. We need to get them, nourishing their body again, so that we can get them back to health as quickly as we possibly can. And so I do think it's important to have that sense of urgency if you do have a kid that you think may be struggling with an eating disorder. And again, for the teachers out there, you may be the only person that picks up on this. You may be the only person that is able to talk to a child about this. And make sure you do it in a private setting and you use non-judgmental language and things like that. But you could be that person that really saves their life, right? So teachers are in a very special position in society to be able to help some of these kids when maybe nobody else would have picked up on it.
So if it could be any gender, any size, any age, then what should we look for? And maybe Oona, you could say, like, how do you have that conversation? Because it's really easy for me as a teacher to have called and said, listen, I'm calling to let you know so-and-so didn't do their homework the past 3 nights. There's a quiz on something like this seems really hard to bring up or broach with somebody, not just the child, but then if you want to bring that back to the caregiver and say, here's something, because I think we all imagine we're overstepping. So how do you navigate that, and what are kind of the signs or things that you could point to help, or do you not bring up things that would help back you up? I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, the first thing I want to say is I want to address another myth that could come into play in this situation. And there was a long-standing myth that families cause eating disorders. And so a teacher might think, oh, like maybe this family has problems and that's why this kid has an eating disorder. So I want to dispel that myth that parents and caregivers are not to blame for their child's eating disorder. And as Dr. Hill mentioned, caregivers can be like the most important piece of recovery. So if parents have or if an educator has a hesitation about involving the family, that's a place to go to your administrator. If you have a school nurse or a school counselor, get some support and come back to those basic rules of when it's a health or safety issue, right? We have to say something. It might be really hard and uncomfortable. and you're coming from a place of concern, not judgment or blame. You're just there, you're on the same page with this caregiver. You both care about this kid's well-being, and you're just sharing that you're concerned. You don't have to diagnose them, right? You are, you don't necessarily know what is going on behind the scenes, but you know something isn't feeling right to you. And so listen to your gut and reach out for help. So that sense of knowing something isn't right, again, I don't think you have to know, oh, this must be this particular eating disorder. You may not know, but just when a student kind of loses their sparkle or they're low energy, they don't seem like themselves. I think, knowing that this is a time to say something. Again, it may be another mental health issue, it could be a medical issue, but listen to your gut. And again, if you approach with non-judgmental language, compassion, just sharing that you're concerned, that's probably going to go a lot better than if you come in like, I'm going to rescue your kid from their eating disorder. But if you come in a little bit more, just that openness and curiosity of how you can support the family, that tends to go a lot better.
This is just a little bit further down that line, I guess. Once it's somebody's already in treatment, and we talked about communicating with the school, but are there things like 504 IEP that a parent should be pursuing or a caregiver should pursue in their communication? What would a good school parent, a caregiver, family relationship look like? And would that include their team of care, medical care as well?
Yeah, I'm so glad you mentioned 504 plans. That tends to be the tool that most families use to get their kid the accommodations that they need during treatment. I think transparency is key. A lot of parents are afraid to tell a school that their child has an eating disorder because of some of the stigma and shame from those myths. So I think it is really important to have that conversation. And teachers can be such a powerful piece of this. Again, they're not part of the treatment team. They don't have to be eating disorder experts, but being that caring adult in that child's life can be a really just critical piece of this child feeling like I'm worth this. I'm worth getting better. This is really hard. And this teacher is looking out for me too.
That's great. So what are some hopeful things, if we know somebody's struggling, is there kind of, okay, as long as we do this, this, and this, we know our outcomes will be great. What can you tell us to give us some positive news, Dr. Hill?
Yeah, so I think instilling hope is one of the most important things I can do for my patients and families. So I have hope that every single patient who has an eating disorder is going to go on to recover from their eating disorder. I think it's also another myth that people, once they have an eating disorder, they're always going to struggle with one. And that's not actually true, particularly for cases where somebody is young when it's identified and they are able to get access to treatment. And EQUIP was really founded to improve the access issue. Historically, eating disorder treatment has been really hard to access. It's been expensive and hard to get to, and often large populations of people with eating disorders haven't been picked up. So we're trying to help solve that. And now that eating disorder treatment is more accessible, our hope is that kids will have a better likelihood of getting over their eating disorder more quickly so they can get back to their lives, right? These are critical years for growing up and developing and learning things. And I want every single one of my patients to get back to living their life and doing what they should be doing at their ages, right? And it doesn't include having an eating disorder. So again, I have hope that 100% of my patients are going to go on to recover. And now that we have ways of providing treatment that allow more flexibility for families, the likelihood is greater more now than ever before.
Could you you said more accessible and more flexible. Can you expand, like really tell me, what does that look like? Because if I'm a parent with a young person in my life that's struggling, and I'm not 100% sure, like, how severe is this? Is this something that maybe I can just keep my eye on it? Or the other end is, do I send them somewhere? What is the flexibility, accessibility, what does that look like for a parent who feels like the only options are really two extremes, that neither one feels comfortable? I mean, I'm sure none of it feels comfortable, right? This is all hard and you want to intervene, but what does more accessible or more flexible look like?
Yeah, that's a great question. And historically, eating disorder treatment has really been one of those two extremes. And for most people, about 80% of 80% of people with eating disorders didn't receive any treatment. And the treatment that was available or is available historically has been programs where a student needs to be pulled from school. They need to move away from home in many cases. And live at a home in another state for a few months. And these are young people we're talking about, right? Who should be in school if they can be. So what EQUIP does is provide an option to continue to have that student be in school, going to drama class, and as long as they're medically cleared, doing the extracurriculars they like, engaging with their peers, doing everything we would want a young person to do because of this virtual model. So we're able to provide a full care team, which includes a therapist that's trained in FBT or family-based treatment, a registered dietitian, a medical provider, a peer mentor, and a family mentor. And those are people with their own lived experience with eating disorders. And all that care team helps support the family all virtually. And we actually know now that virtual treatment can be just as effective as in-person treatment for eating disorders. And we've published a paper that really shows that. So using this virtual model, we are able to really give more access to all people with eating disorders. And we're also in network with many insurance companies that maybe wouldn't have paid for the residential facility that required the child to be sent away for a few months, but they do cover our treatment. So EQUIP has helped really solve some of those access gaps that have existed traditionally. And that's something that we really truly are on a mission to continue to improve so that everybody with an eating disorder can have access to care, and not just care, but care that's effective and it works.
Got it.
And I'd love, can I
Yeah.
add on one thing too that I think
Yeah.
is so fantastic in terms of that school home communication, is that in addition to that, multidisciplinary care team, you also have access to our family experience navigators who are experts in things like 504 plans and are really the family's advocate and support, because it's overwhelming. Your child already has an eating disorder and now you've got to go to the school and ask for things. And you don't have to do that alone when you're with EQUIP. You really have someone who's there to be your support. And if there is any pushback from the school, which sometimes there is, most of the time schools are so happy to help. Some schools just don't maybe have enough information. And that's where our family experience team really comes in and provides that education and advocacy to really support that child to stay in school and still work on their recovery. So I'm really proud of that as something that we offer at EQUIP.
That's fantastic. Tell me, Oona, we didn't get from you what you're hopeful about. What do you say, for someone who is like, this sounds really scary and overwhelming, and we started this off with, this is the second deadliest disorder affecting young people. What are you hopeful about? How do we turn that around and make this something that people know that they can recover from?
Yeah, I think so much comes down to that education piece. And once we can break through the myths and misconceptions, once you start learning about eating disorders as a parent and you get empowered and supported to fight the eating disorder, recovery actually can feel inevitable, right? You know what you're doing, you're getting support step by step rather than this unattainable goal. Actually, you can kind of see how you're making progress with your child. And I'll say, my child did all those other kinds of treatments, residential, PHP, hospitalization, and really wasn't getting better until we did FBT. If only we had done FBT first, if I had a time machine, that's what I would change. But the idea of empowering the whole family is really giving kids the strongest, best chance of full recovery. And I've lived it in my own house, and I've worked with so many families who've gotten through the other side as well. So recovery is possible, and families can be the key component to making that happen.
Is there a place where, especially when you talk about your own family, you think, okay, not only was I worried about this one, but I may be repeating some of these, the way we talk about food with all of my children. Is there a place with resources where we can kind of go back after we're done this conversation, and caregivers or others that are interested could pull some materials and maybe take a second look at how we're framing those conversations?
Yeah, absolutely. Should I share a few right now?
Yeah, we would love that. I think
so-
everyone likes resources.
Yeah, so the Full Bloom Project, they have both downloadable resources, online courses, and a great podcast. But the Full Bloom podcast was started by two FBT eating disorder therapists. Now it's one of those therapists still runs the program, and there's just phenomenal resources. The other one I would recommend, Sunny Side Up Nutrition. They also have a podcast, newsletter, lots of great parent education about nutrition. And then for the sort of the educators out there, I would highly recommend checking out Dietitians for Teachers, and 4 is the numeral. Dietitians for Teachers is run by a woman named Gwen Costal, and she has terrific ways to take, like, let's say your state standard, she's actually in Canada, but her framework still works for the US, where let's say the requirement is to teach the My Plate. How can you teach My Plate without accidentally triggering someone into disordered eating or shame about their food? So I would highly recommend that for both for educators and for parents who want to start bringing some of this into their school. So this would be kind of my top 3 at the top of my head that I would recommend.
Oh, I love those. Thank you, Oona. How about you, Dr. Hill? Do you have some resources for us?
Yeah, absolutely. So a great resource for parents in particular is called FEAST. It's an acronym, FEAST, and they have a resource called the First 30 Days, which is a free educational program for parents that every day for 30 days, it sends them a lesson on eating disorders and teaches them about FBT and what that might look like. And a lot of parents out there that I know have been able to start the FBT process even before they are able to get into treatment and get a head start on it. And that's been really, really helpful for many of my patients and families. Certainly, if you want to do some reading, the National Eating Disorder Association, NEDA or NEDA, is a good place to look. Our Equip website has a blog that I encourage you to check out as well. Every Thursday, we have a free open to the public parental support group, a family support group. So it's run by some great people who have lived eating disorders and have been there. And so they've got some great offerings every single week. And so if you've got a kid struggling with an eating disorder, I really encourage you to check out that free family support group as well.
That's perfect. Thank you both so much. This was really informative, so helpful. I appreciate you sharing your time and all of this great information. And I look forward to keeping this going and getting our kids off to a really strong start this school year. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Amy. Appreciate it.
Thank you.